Hello and welcome to today's webinar. Thank you to Gerhard Erasmus for presenting today, and this is part of our IATEFL Festival series. So Gerhard is actually going to be presenting this session as a workshop at the IATEFL Conference in Brighton. Gerhard is well known in the Australian ELICOS community. He's a regular contributor to the English Australia Journal, and he's also presented at the English Australia Conference. He is one of the admins of the Oz ELT Facebook group and also a regular contributor to that as well. At the moment, he's working for the British Council in Taipei, where he coordinates the Young Learners Program. So thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you, Sophie. Thanks for the introduction. The workshop, the focus of the workshop, as you can see on the screen, will be about managing and developing teachers with lower English proficiency. So in short, the aims of it will be to contextualize with a little story. This I can tell you in advance, it's not a true story, but it will be told from a first-person perspective. We'll look at teacher language in the classroom, discuss what lower level learners need and how teachers can supply that, and then we'll link classroom language and learner needs to things that we can actually develop with teachers that have lower English proficiency, and then at the end apply some of the key ideas to your context. Now, I think globally people that work in, for example, Asia would have had exposure to lots of teachers with their English teachers, but their English proficiency is lower. Potentially A2 or B1 on the CFR. But I think if you're working in Australia, the majority of the exposure that you would have with this would be if teachers come over to Australia to do teacher training programs or maybe to do language programs. So in terms of that, keep everything that we're doing related to your context as far as possible. What the workshop is not, I'm not going to really discuss the native versus non-native speaker debate. Something I will say on that is I do think that sometimes non-native speakers that have lower proficiency are left outside of that debate, and as a result they don't always get the support that they actually do need. I am going to speak about language tests and language testing very briefly, but it's not a critique of language tests or language testing, and while this will obviously come up, this is also not going to be a workshop on international English or global English or ELF or anything like that. So the story that I promised, while I'm telling it, you can think how it's going to end. I had a teacher in the office. She had a cup of coffee in her hand. I accidentally bumped into her and the coffee fell on the table. Nothing important on the table. And one of the other teachers said, why did you spill your coffee? Now the natural response is, she would say, because Gerhard bumped me. However, her response was not that. Her response was because there was coffee in my cup. Both the other teacher and myself went, it's a very strange answer. And she said, well, if there was water in the cup, I would have spilled water. And if there was tea in the cup, I would have spilled tea. And if there was soda in the cup, I would have spilled soda. And then she told us that the response actually comes from a story that she'd heard from a friend of hers or a relative, basically saying that the thing you spill when you get bumped is the thing that's already in your cup. Now, it's a very nice life story. In relation to teachers with lower proficiency, that relates to how are they responding to things that happen in the class if the stress level increases. So the focus of this is to see how we can change what they currently have in their cups to make sure if they get into difficult situations in the classroom that they do things that are pedagogically good and that actually addresses the aims of their learners. Important because as English teaching has developed over the past few decades, and it has, I think it's gotten a lot better, it's a lot more structure. There are still pockets of things that are not ideal in a classroom that tend to consistently happen, mostly because that is what we're used to. That's basically what's in our cup, because that's what we've been exposed to as language learners if we learned or studied another language. So, as I said, it's a workshop. So what you can do is you can pause the webinar, look through the questions. If you're with somebody else, you can have a quick discussion about it. And then when you're ready to go, you can just hit play again. So the objective of this discussion really is just to make sure that you keep your own context in mind, and that you have some kind of an idea of where you could be contributing to the development of teachers with lower English proficiency. So I did say I was going to quickly mention language tests. A lot of places, a lot of schools would say that need teachers with a certain language ability, and that means that these teachers have to do language tests. Now, when the teachers want to develop their English ability and maybe progress, the natural thing that they do is they study for the next test. So it could be IELTS, it could be TOEIC or TOEFL. Something that is quite popular in terms of level-by-level progression would be the Cambridge Main Street exams. But if you're looking at, for example, the speaking part of those exams, what do they test? They test things like agreeing and disagreeing, making suggestions, describing a picture, describing a situation. You get assessed on discourse management, interactive communication, grammatical and lexical range and accuracy. But the concern is that that is not the language that these teachers actually need to be effective in the classroom. It is the language they need to be effective in life and outside of the classroom, but the language that we need inside of the classroom is a little bit more specific. So do these interventions in terms of helping them develop in-class language actually work? What you can see on the screen is results from a British Council project. It's called English for Teaching, Teaching for English. This is from Nepal. And if you look at the before and after figures, you can see that an intervention in terms of how to use English and what English to use in the classroom had a very, very positive effect on what they did after training. Something I will mention later is, discuss later, is the unfortunate issue, again, the issue with the cup, what's in the cup, is if, as you progress past the training, I think if you immediately after the training assess how things have changed and then do that same assessment 6 months or a year later, you would find that there's some kind of a regression towards what happened before the training, which is why I think it's important that we consistently work on this. Two key things here that I think is important. Teachers using English in the classroom is up at 96% after training, and teachers giving instructions in English up to 96%. And then because of the increased use of English in the classroom, the students have increased their interaction in English in the classroom as well, if you look at these. So again, something where you can pause the webinar and discuss what issues do teachers with lower proficiency face? What issues do they have? Again, if you're with somebody else, you can have a quick discussion, and when you're ready, you can hit play. Now, I am hoping in the time that you pause it that maybe you've come up with a few better ideas than I have on the next slide. But these are some of them. Confidence issues. Because they are low proficiency, they have confidence issues in terms of, are they saying things correctly? Are they teaching the correct things? They have pronunciation and pronunciation knowledge issues, language and linguistic knowledge issues. Now, this is a key area where I think these teachers are being excluded from the native, non-native teacher debate. I don't think it's a debate. I don't think we should even be having that debate. But a very proficient non-native speaker has excellent linguistic knowledge. However, a teacher that's at CFR A2 or B1 do not. And they often struggle to see finer points and understand what it is that they need to be teaching their beginner level students and what not. Struggles with the classroom language, struggling with unpacking skills. So if they're reading, for example, at a B1 or B2 level, it's a lot more difficult for them to unpack the skills that the students would need than what it is if they were a proficient reader. And then obviously language proficiency. And then the last question I have here is, does it have to be communicative? It's very nice and it's very good to have a communicative classroom. However, I'm not convinced that the environment in which these teachers work always require that, or that it's always the best option. I do think it's very good that they be encouraged to move into more communicative kind of language teaching. However, it's important that you don't make massive switches that completely disengage both the teachers and their students. Another time to pause. What do teachers with low proficiency have in common with each other? And when you discuss this, if you're with somebody else, try to focus on things that we can act on. And then when you're ready, you can hit play. Again, as with the previous one, I hope that you have a few more or better ideas than I have. What I do have, most of the time, if not all of the time, they have a shared language with their students. So, for example, teachers in Taiwan that are of low proficiency, that teach locally, would share their L1 with their students. The same would go for places like Japan, Korea. The local teachers would have the same language as their students. Now, a lot of, I assume it's more marketing than anything else, a lot of schools would have an English-only policy. All the places where I've worked at, where I had control over this policy, it was not English only, but we had an English first policy, meaning try to say it in English, and if you can't, then you're not prohibited from using L1. But on the other side of that, it's often much easier for teachers if there are very, very fine points of the language that they need to clarify to students, or simply just checking understanding, saying, so there's a new word, there might be a flashcard or a picture or something, but what is that word in Chinese? Just to make sure that there is, the comprehension is there. Now that's, I think, a very, very big benefit, and it is something that they have in common with each other. More often than not, they teach lower levels. Somebody that is at CFR B1 would not be teaching people at B1, because I think they won't be able to notice errors if they're making the same errors. Whenever I have employed teachers with a lower proficiency, our general, we wouldn't call it a rule, but what we did was they could teach 2 levels below their own level. So, for example, if we had someone at B1 level, they could teach anything up to A1, and as we used the Cambridge Young Learner exams, that meant they could teach up to movers. So they could teach beginner classes where they were learning the alphabet, they could teach the starters and movers level of the exams. The third thing that I have is they are language learners. A teacher that is of lower proficiency is not, well, at least not in my experience, they don't stop and go, like, I know enough English, I don't want to get better, I'm just an English teacher. They always want to get better, so they are actually language learners as well. And the majority of the time, now I've got a big or here, they teach children or teenagers, but, and it's something the last thing is something I've experienced more in the last year or two, there is a push towards English as a medium of instruction. So some of the lower proficiency teachers that I have encountered over the last year or two are lecturers at university. They have very, very strong subject knowledge, but lower English proficiency. Now, one big difference here is, again, something that you could keep in mind if you do training programs for teachers from Asia, and I guess from other countries with similar kind of contexts and environments, is in an EMI environment, they don't always share the language with their students. So you'd have professors in Taiwan that need to present their lectures or their lessons in English, but now they have students that are mostly from Taiwan, but there are foreign students that are also doing degrees at local universities, so that shared language idea disappears, which makes it a bit more difficult, I guess. Again, time where you can pause and have a quick discussion. What do lower level learners need? And when you're done, you can hit play. I've got 2 slides for this. So the first one is from Halliday. What do lower level learners need, and what do they use the language for? And I mean, this would apply to more than just lower level learners, but there are 7 functions: instrumental, making things happen; regulatory, controlling events; making statements, conveying facts, and explaining; the representational function; the interactional function; social maintenance; the personal function to say how you feel or to express emotions; the function of acquiring knowledge; and imaginative, where they have to create, well, where they create imaginary systems or ideas. Now, it's important that teachers are aware of this, I feel, because I think a lot of focus is on the representational function, making statements, conveying facts, explaining, reporting, and there isn't always enough focus on the other things that we need or that we use language for. And then, in addition, they need support and scaffolding to get to use these functions appropriately. They need exposure to comprehensible English, which is why it's important that the teacher speaks English in the classroom. They need confidence using the language. Now, I did say earlier, it might not always be the best to have a communicative classroom in environments where that's not the norm, although I do think that a lot of places are moving towards communicative teaching as the norm. Nonetheless, the students would need some practice with the language so that they have confidence using it. Most of them would need to pass exams, and as much as that makes me sad, the unfortunate reality is that especially younger learners and teenagers, they have school exams, and they need to pass those exams. And then the last one that I copied from Lewis, grammar as a receptive skill. Very often, because grammar is something that can easily be tested, I think it's taught very explicitly, very rule-based, and the problem with it is that the students don't always understand the grammar that they're learning in terms of what does it mean, but they can form sentences and use the grammar and structures, albeit not always accurately. And I think at lower levels, it's important that teachers are made aware of the fact that even if they are testing grammar, it's important that the focus be on grammar as a receptive skill in terms of can they decode and can they understand and convey meaning with the grammar that they've learned. And there is a point later on where I discuss observations, and in terms of looking at that from an observation point of view. So areas of focus, I think, that we can work on in terms of developing and managing these teachers is how to model and how to set up tasks in the classroom, help them with language analysis that's relevant to the level. So yes, the analysis of language is noun-verb parts of speech, exemplification and different meaning of words, but it's also the ability to choose when to teach something and when not to teach something, analyzing what is appropriate for the level that you're teaching or the context that you're teaching, and in terms of making teaching decisions. Error correction, when to do it, and how to do it. And it is something from my experience that I think they shy away from for fear of maybe mispronouncing something that they know a student has mispronounced, or correcting something that is not incorrect. And then the last thing, classroom language, and I've got a bit more of that on the next slide. So instead of, if you think back of what gets tested in language exams, the language that they do need in the classroom would be the language to instruct, the language to encouraging, praising, nominating, prompting, and then how to give error correction and feedback. Now, a key thing here is encouraging and praising. It's the kind of language that's very, very easy to learn, and it is something that I think, especially if you work with young learners, it is fairly important. Very close to the end, issues that I think they face and they have. One, teach the way I was taught, and that refers again back to that what's in the cup. A lot of the times, if stressful situations arise, or you've been to training and you've been back at work for 6 months or a year, is teachers revert back to teaching the way they were taught because that's what they've had the most exposure to. And it's why I think it's important that we actually make sure that we consistently try to develop their skills and how they work with English in the classroom. And I did mention earlier grammar as a receptive skill. So I'm going to talk about observations. I asked to observe a few classes where the teachers were teaching relative clauses to students. It is something that seems to be very popular. And in all the classes, the teachers focused on dividing nouns into groups and which relative pronoun would go with which group. And it is long explanations and lots of practice. And in Chinese, if you want to translate a relative clause, the easiest way to do that is with the possessive de. And at the end of all of these classes, I'd ask the students, what is the sentence? What is the sentence in Chinese? And none of them could tell me. Now, the reason I bring this up is I asked the teachers why they teach it in this specific way, and they said, well, because that's the way it has always been taught. Now, I find that problematic in terms of the students encounter a relative clause in a reading or in a listening, for example, that they are not able to decode what it means. But that is the way that it was taught to the teachers, and that's the way that they teach it. In terms of observations, if a teacher does an observation, so what am I looking for? I being the teacher, not myself. In terms of having post-observation feedback meetings with teachers of lower proficiency that I've worked with, very often if they do observations, they look at ways to teach. So, for example, new activities, a new way of doing something, and they often have a massive bank of activities that they can do in the classroom, games they can play, fun things to do. But I don't think that's what they should be looking for. I think what they should be looking for is how is the teacher that I'm observing doing, apologies, doing error correction, how are they giving instructions, how are they modeling. So I think it's important that they are told what to actually look for in lessons, and to give feedback on that and to experiment with those things in the classroom. I can say that I have observed a few lessons where I've actually taken activities from teachers that are maybe not as great in English, but they are really, really good teachers. And I don't think they need to be developing their teaching skills as much as what they need to be developing their ability to use English to make the most of their teaching skills. The flip side of that then is if my manager is going to observe me, what are they going to be looking for? And I think if you are working in that kind of an environment, it is again important that if you want the teacher to work on how they're giving instructions or how they're doing error correction or how they're modeling or setting up tasks, that you tell them that's what I'm going to be looking for, so that it is something that is consistently explored and developed. And then the two last questions really refers to the fact that they need certification, something that I think to some extent is sad. But yeah, which is the right course for me? There are courses on like Coursera or FutureLearn that they can do. Cambridge has the CELT S and the CELT P, but it's maybe a little bit more difficult to access it in Taiwan. But very often they do want to do teaching courses. And again, I think in my experience, in terms of teaching skills, they're actually not bad. They're actually relatively fairly good teachers. And a lot of them, at least those that I've had exposure to, are, for example, public school teachers, or they train teachers, and they just end up in teaching English. And then the other thing is they need the feeling of, I need a certificate to show that I can speak English. So there's that constant push towards getting maybe a PT or an FCE or a CAE kind of certificate, so I can show people that I can speak English. And again, I think it's disappointing that the market requires this, but it is something to keep in mind. While it is important to develop their English ability in the classroom, it is also important to keep in mind that they do need some kind of confirmation of their ability. So if you do manage or try to develop these teachers, it's important to keep in mind that while the focus should be, in my opinion, on classroom language, you would need some kind of language development element to your program as well. This brings us pretty much to the end. Now, the last slide does have questions and comments, something that we cannot do right now. But you can find me on social media if you do have any questions or comments. But yes, just 3 things for you to think about. If you were in a group great. If not, which of the ideas maybe that were on the slides is something that could apply in your context? What of the suggestions could you, or what suggestions could you make to improve programs for teachers with low proficiency, both in your context and elsewhere? And if you do have comments and you'd like to discuss them with me, or get involved in an online chat about it, please do find me. And then the last thing, how could we follow up on issues these teachers face? Now, just to conclude, I think if you're working in an environment where there are lots of these teachers, it's important to have things in place. And I think those teachers might have more experience with the difficulties that these teachers face. I think if you're in a country where the majority of exposure towards these teachers would be in terms of study tours, or teacher training programs, whether it's short-term programs delivered in country, or if it's short-term products delivered offshore, that they do have certain issues, and that when there is intervention, that the intervention often have positive outcomes. And I think we're moving in a very good direction, but I'm sure longer discussions and a better look at what they need might actually help us identify more things that we can work on, and hopefully develop and support them better. Thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you online to discuss this further.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much for that, Gerhard. And where would people find you online? Is AusELT the best place?
That would more than likely be the best place. Yes.
Yes. Okay. So for those of you that are not familiar with the AusELT Facebook page, it's hashtag capital AUS, so capital A, small u, small s, and then capital ELT. Thank you so much for your session today.
Thank you, Savi.
Good luck at the IATEFL.
Great, and I look forward to seeing you hopefully in Sydney very, very well with the next year conference.
Yes, we look forward to that too.